Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be part 4 of chapter 3, William James and the Varieties of Religious Experience. Again, this is part 4, Conclusion. In sum, I believe that James offers a very illuminating analysis of the utility of individual religion, and despite some of the problems I've alluded to throughout this chapter, I think he offers an invaluable contribution to the study of religion's utility. By and large, he makes a good case for several of the benefits he associates with religion. Nevertheless, in the preceding analysis, I have alluded to several problems with his account of religion's utility. I have argued, for example, that a proper analysis of religion's utility must remain open to the less desirable elements of religion that James himself purposely ignores or downplays. Hence, the institutional components of religion, which I have suggested pervade most religious experience and have palpable consequences, which James does not deny, must not be ignored. I have also voiced concerns about the feasibility of James's distinction between individual and institutional religion. His notion of individual religion requires the existence of pattern setters, but I suggested that there is good reason to wonder whether such pattern setters actually exist. Furthermore, less intelligent forms of individual religion, which spawn more detrimental consequences thanks to their excesses, should not be minimized, which James seems inclined to do. Similarly, I have expressed concerns regarding his exclusively optimistic interpretation of religion. In point of fact, some who we would naturally call religious do not seem so optimistic, granted many do. Additionally, I mentioned my concerns regarding his broad conception of religion throughout the chapter, which echoes much of what I said regarding Mill's similar conception in chapter 1. Finally, I contended that James is too dismissive of the prospects of pure naturalism. This is probably what I find most problematic regarding James's analysis. I am not convinced that the kind of existential relief he says can only be found by way of religion, especially the twice-born type, cannot in fact be found elsewhere. Clearly, to say that religion engenders happiness is one thing, and to say that it yields a higher kind of happiness that can be found nowhere else is quite another. The latter is a much stronger claim, and subsequently it is much tougher to defend than the former claim. In my view, while James is careful in trying to distinguish a certain pitch of optimism belonging solely to religion, separating it from morality and naturalism, he does not adequately demonstrate that the religious are, in fact, capable of a unique or higher kind of happiness. I think he is right when he suggests that religion can engender greater happiness than morality, but I do not think he makes a good case against naturalism. James is clearly skeptical of the prospects of pure naturalism when it comes to making people happy and satisfying their self-reflective nature. But, contrary to what he suggests, I do believe naturalism can work for some, and that it is not destined to sadness and despair. Nor is it shallow, as James contends, and I believe it can and does suffice for some, proving capable of generating a kind of happiness rivaling the relief he associates with supernatural religion. Hence, in much the same way Nietzsche undervalues twice-born religious experience, James undervalues once-born religious experience. As we saw in section B of part 3 in chapter 1, Mill certainly has his doubts about James's position too. Footnote 702. As I indicated in this same section of chapter 1, Sigmund Freud argues science can yield the same kind of satisfaction religion is thought to engender. End of footnote 702. He claims, for example, that, quote, history so far as we know it bears out the opinion that mankind can perfectly well do without the belief in a heaven, end quote. Footnote 703 cites the source. While James contends that the Greeks, quote, knew no joys comparable in quality of preciousness to those which we shall ere long see that Brahmins, Buddhists, Christians, Mohammedans, twice-born people whose religion is non-naturalistic, get from their several creeds of mysticism and renunciation, end quote. Footnote 704 cites the source. Mill counters that, quote, we neither find that the Greeks enjoyed life less, nor feared death more than other people, end quote. Footnote 705 cites the source. On this point, I ultimately agree with Mill. As I suggested, if it turns out that the supernatural goods religions promise are not necessary for this kind of optimism and existential relief James suggests religion solely engenders, then the case for religion's utility surely loses some of its force. However, I believe James does an admirable job of demonstrating how religion does yield significant existential relief to some who would otherwise remain hopeless in the face of evil. Indeed, Varieties is, in a sense, one long testament to this particular fruit of religion. James believes, as do I, that Nietzsche's naturalism will prove insufficient and generally unsatisfactory for many, perhaps even most people. As I argued in chapter 2, I think that Nietzsche fails to properly estimate the value of twice-born religious experience. i.e. the supernatural religions associated with his slaves, insofar as he categorically condemns it and thus fails to appreciate that, as his own philosophy suggests, some require such experience in order to be healthy. Without it, some would be unable to cope with the pain and suffering inherent in earthly life, just as he himself suggests. This is a point that James clearly recognizes, as I hope to have shown throughout this chapter, and as a result, he offers a much more sympathetic perspective of religion than Nietzsche does in this regard, which I think is warranted. Religion may not produce a unique kind of happiness, as James contends it does, but it surely can engender happiness, and for some individuals, it may prove to be a requirement for happiness. If nothing else, Varieties offers a thorough defense of these positions, and religion ought to be credited accordingly as a result. I now turn to the conclusion of this dissertation, where I form some conclusions regarding the utility of religion that I think are warranted based on the foregoing textual analyses. So again, that was part 4 of chapter 3 of William James and the varieties of religious experience from the utility of religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. Thanks.